Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, once again with Michael Troy, talking about the generals of the Revolutionary War. Michael, thank you for coming back.
Always a pleasure to be here, Jason.
All right, well, let's get right into it. Today, we're talking about the five gentlemen appointed to Major General in the Continental Army on February 19th, 1777. All of them appointed ahead of Benedict Arnold, as we discussed at length last week. One of the major things that made Arnold upset. So, why don't we start from the top? The highest ranking of these five men, appointed on the same day, they were given rank. And number one is William Alexander, aka Lord Stirling. So, why don't we go back to the beginning? Tell us a little bit about William Alexander.
Okay, well, William Alexander is a native born colonist. His father came from Scotland, where he had to leave in a bit of a hurry because he was part of the Jacobite Rising. And once the British crushed that, that was not a good place to live anymore. So he came over to New York and got married to a local girl, started to raise a family, became a quite wealthy lawyer, um, got into a little bit of trouble with the governor of New York. At times, they were a bit of political rivals. His father actually ended up being disbarred because of some of the tactics he took during his defense of Peter Zenger, who you may know was a newspaper editor who was prosecuted for libel in the early 1700s. Um, but anyway, his father, Alexander, uh, passed on a relatively sizable fortune to William, uh, mostly because he married a very wealthy widow. So most of the money came from mom's side of the family. But yeah, so William Alexander uh, was, living in the early mid 18th century in New York. Uh, Very wealthy man. Ended up with, as I said, a sizable estate in New York, which he sold to buy an even larger estate over in New Jersey. And when his father died, I believe in late 1760s, uh, William Alexander decided to reclaim his earldom as the Earl of Stirling. His grandfather had been the fifth Earl of Stirling, and of course, when his father uh, rose up and rebelled against British rule and fled the country, he did not bother to seek becoming the sixth Earl of Stirling because he probably would have been hanged and drawn and quartered as a traitor if he showed his face anywhere near Britain again. But when his father passed, William thought, well, I haven't done anything wrong. Why can't I be the sixth Earl of Stirling? And so he tried to make his case for that. And he was actually approved by the British or the Scottish House of Lords. They granted him his earldom, but the British House of Lords rejected it. And I'm not entirely clear why. I've heard conflicting reasons as to why. I mean, it may have been part because they just decided to end the earldom as a result of the treason in the family. Others say it was more a result of Stirling having become a colonist, and they really didn't want to be bestowing lordships on mere colonists. Whatever the reason, the British House of Lords rejected his claim to the earldom of Stirling, but Lord Stirling nevertheless said that it was his of right, and he insisted that everybody call him Lord Stirling uh, in the colonies.
Right, which jumping ahead a little bit, it's always hilarious for me. George Washington always writes to Sterling, and he addresses it as my lord, which
Right.
even like during the Revolutionary War, he's still referencing him as my lord. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, even in the late war, there was not really the decision to get rid of titles entirely. Nobody was really clear where that was going to land. Some of the states began to look frown upon titles, and it wasn't really until the adoption of the Constitution in 1787 that these titles were pretty much outlawed.
right. So Sterling's in New York. He already has this little bit of grief with Great Britain, and things start getting hot and heavy. in New York?
Yeah, he doesn't have much military background. By much, I mean any. He
Fair enough.
was a very wealthy, socially prominent man in New Jersey, one of the wealthiest men in New Jersey. Um, but he was an early patriot and a strong, outspoken supporter of the patriot cause. When things started to get rough, he formed his own militia regiment and used his own personal fortune to outfit the regiment on his own dime. So, with that, he received a colonelcy in the Continental Army. And when things began to heat up in the Mid Atlantic states and things kind of moved away from New England, and they were looking for people in the Mid Atlantic colonies to promote, Lord Stirling was at the front of the list, and he received a commission as a brigadier general, the first brigadier general from New Jersey, and uh, began his career in the Continental Army.
Yeah, and he joins them. His first engagement of note is the Battle of Brooklyn or Long Island.
Yes, Lord Stirling never went to New England. The army came to him. He lived very close to New York City, and he was put in command of the forces on Long Island, and was noted in battle for leading an impressive defense. He defended or led the Maryland and Delaware regiments, who gained a lot of fame in the battle for standing up against overwhelming odds and allowing the rest of the army a chance to escape. Um, at the very end of the fighting, Stirling actually led a charge, a desperate charge with the few hundred men he may have had still under his command, and was quickly subdued and captured by the British and became a prisoner of war. Uh,
Yep.
he didn't remain a prisoner very long. General Howe was at this point trying to really encourage uh, ending the war and getting back to a good relationship. So he was kind of using a light touch with his, especially with the captured officers. He offered Lord Stirling the opportunity to go back and speak with Congress about reconciliation. Lord Stirling refused, and his fellow General Sullivan, who we talked about a couple of weeks ago, took up the offer, and he's the one who carried the message to Congress. But Lord Stirling was exchanged relatively quickly. The Americans had a governor from the Bahamas, Montfort Brown, who the Continental Navy had been down to the Bahamas a few months earlier to steal some gunpowder. They didn't get much gunpowder, but they did kidnap the governor and bring him back to America, and he was exchanged for Lord Stirling. And when Lord Stirling returned and given his impressive feats on the battlefield and the fact that they wanted a New Jersey officer, he got the promotion to Major General in early 1777.
Right, and he makes it back in time for the crossing of the Delaware and Princeton, Trenton, all the good stuff in Jersey.
Yes, yeah, as I said, he was released in exchange within a matter of months. So, yes, he's back in time for the crossing of the Delaware and for Trenton and Princeton, and he puts himself very well at those as well.
And I understand he very quickly becomes uh, a, a, George Washington becomes a very big fan of Lord Stirling. They become quite close.
The two men get along very well. They're both wealthy landowners. They have a very similar background, all that good stuff. And he has a reasonable amount of respect for Lord Stirling's efforts on the battlefield. He doesn't really trust Lord Stirling with an independent command during the course of the war, but he is a very valuable second in command to the Continental Army on quite a few occasions.
Yeah.
Um, During the Philadelphia campaign, he's very active in Brandywine, Germantown, and afterward at Monmouth. Does not do really quite so well at Monmouth, but he doesn't really take the blame for that. General Lee does. But he also really proves his loyalty to General Washington when he discloses the existence of the Conway Cabal. Colonel Wilkinson had come down to bring news of the victory at Saratoga and stopped off at the headquarters of Lord Sterling, and that's where he got into these conversations about, hey, have you guys really thought about replacing Washington with General Gates, and here's why we should do it. And Sterling immediately took this information to General Washington and made clear that he was standing by Washington's side in this whole debate.
Right, and kind of smothers it before it can become too large. I also understand that on at least two occasions, when Washington would go meet with Congress, he'd actually leave the Continental Army under the control of General Alexander.
Yeah, Washington very rarely left the army for any significant period of time, but he did go to Philadelphia for about 6 weeks um, in the winter of, what was that, 78, 79, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, that sounds right. Because,
I
yeah,
think so.
77, 78, it was, couldn't go to Philadelphia because the British were there. Um, so, yeah, about 6 weeks during the winter, he went to Philadelphia. That was a lot longer than he had actually planned to stay, but he was trying to talk Congress out of trying to invade Quebec again. So he left Lord Sterling in command of the army for an extended period of time, and that was really the longest anyone other than Washington was in charge of the main army.
Right. And then, from my understanding, there's not a whole lot of note that comes in Alexander's career, unless there's something I'm forgetting in the later years of the war. I believe he does. Is he at Valley Forge?
He
I'm not sure if he's actually at Valley Forge.
I think he was in command of a force in New Jersey while the rest of the Americans were in Valley Forge.
I'm sorry.
Or
When I
no,
said
I'm sorry. No, he was in Reading, Pennsylvania.
yeah, when I said Valley Forge, I meant to say Yorktown. I don't know why I went back in time to
Uh,
Valley Forge. I meant to say Yorktown. Is he
I
at?
don't think he. No. I don't think he was at Yorktown. He was given command of the Hudson Valley. I think after Israel Putnam had a stroke and left the service.
Oh,
So he was in upstate New York. I think when the main army headed down to Yorktown.
yeah. You know what I'm seeing in my notes here is he's actually the one Washington left in charge when Washington went south for Yorktown. He left
Okay, so
Alexander in charge of the units up north, which makes sense. As we said, Washington liked to leave him in charge when nothing was going on.
right. He certainly hoped nothing was going on, but it was a risky thing. I mean, Washington left about 4 or 5 thousand troops near New York, and Henry Clinton had 15,000 troops in New York City. So
Right.
it was kind of a risky proposition. But yeah, everybody expected the main action to be happening down in Virginia at that point.
Right.
So yeah, he got left behind. He was given some independent commands in the Hudson Valley during those 2 years after Yorktown, when not much happened, and unfortunately got sick and died. He suffered from gout and a few other things, and it got the better of him. He died in 1783, a few months before the end of the war.
Right. So it kind of suddenly and like yeah, unfortunately, just shy of the ability to see. I mean, the war was over for all intents and purposes, but like you said, it was January, I believe, so it was still about 2 months out from the actual, um, the preliminary articles of peace being signed and sent back to England.
Right,
So
he'd never received word of the final peace treaty and all that. He unfortunately passed away before that. But yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of the generals who we really remember are the ones who went on to prestigious political positions after the war. He
right,
never had an opportunity to do that, unfortunately.
right, or were martyred on the field.
Honored on the field.
He was not. He
So
just got sick
didn't
and
get
died
either.
right at the end there. Like,
Yeah, it's a very unimpressive way to die, but that's what he got. His daughter did actually marry a U.S. congressman, though, William Dewar.
she married
So
William Dewar, right? The one who
yeah,
almost bankrupted the United States due to his speculation. And we should note he married one of the into the Livingston family.
he did marry Livingston. I didn't have time to look up exactly what her relationship was within that family, but yeah,
Yeah,
he was a very powerful Livingston family member.
her name is eluding me. I apologize. But she was the daughter of William Livingston, who was governor of New Jersey forever, and a sister of Sarah Livingston J. I want to say Catherine, but I don't want to make that assumption. Spouse
Sarah
Sarah
Livingston.
Livingston.
Yeah, his
Oh,
daughter. Catherine. Catherine's the one who married Dewar, I think.
I
Yeah.
apologize. Nope, there's so many William Livingstons. She was the daughter of Philip Livingston, who signed the Declaration of Independence, and was at the he actually went to the Albany Conference of 1754 with Ben Franklin, and he was at the Stamp Act Congress. So she married that side of the Livingston family. Um, so he married a Sarah Livingston, and John Jay also married a Sarah Livingston, who were cousins.
Oh, okay.
Anyway,
But yeah, regardless of what branch it was a very wealthy, prestigious, and powerful
yeah,
family in New York that he married into.
yeah. If you're going to marry a family in the North, it should be a Livingston, I believe is how it's supposed to go. Sorry, Schuyler sister fans from the play, but that was the real
Yeah.
powerful family in New York. So we should move on now to Thomas Mifflin, who himself has a really interesting career. So Mifflin's from Pennsylvania, and he's the first major general from Pennsylvania that we've come across.
Yes, he is the first. He was a merchant before the war. He was born in Philadelphia, so born and raised, local boy. Worked for William Biddle. The Biddle was a very well known merchant family within Philadelphia and became even much bigger in the 19th century. But he ended up starting his own merchant company
Yeah,
before the war.
we've
Uh,
spoken about the Biddles here. I have one viewer who's a very big Biddle fan. Jane is going to be very excited to hear that name come up. I've done more Biddles than you might imagine on Founder of the Day.
there's a
No,
lot of the Biddle family was extremely prominent in the history of Philadelphia.
right, and
But
really important to the war effort too.
absolutely. But yeah, so Mifflin, as I said, he did work for Biddle for a short time in his early life, but then he settled. He went out on his own. He was formed a partnership with his brother. They formed their own mercantile business. Uh, he also worked in the or served in the Pennsylvania Assembly, so he was kind of an up and comer politician slash businessman in the area. Very big supporter of the war and of opposing British taxation, all that stuff. He went to the First and Second Continental Congress and joined the militia very before the war actually even broke out. And for a Quaker, that was a really big step. He was a Quaker, which of course are pacifists and have as a religious duty not to oppose the leader of the country because they're ordained by God. So his activities got him kicked out of the Quaker church, uh, but he went on because of his militia activities and because of his he had actually been to college, which not a lot of colonists had been. So his intellectual abilities, Washington actually hired him as an aide de camp at the beginning of the war, and I think he started the war as a major in the Continental Army. But that didn't last long. He was quickly Washington kind of forced him to become the was it the commissary general?
Commissary, yeah.
Or, yeah, quartermaster, I think is actually
Okay.
the title. Which is responsible for feeding the entire army, which was not an easy task when you had no organization, no structure, no money.
It's a job no
So
one wants.
nobody wanted the job, but he got stuck with it and was promoted to brigadier general and was which is quite a leap from major, but yeah, he was given a big position. They gave him the promotion to go along with it. Um,
Which I
Typically, people in his position would not be combat officers. They would strictly be serving and doing their logistical duties. But Mifflin wanted to be involved in combat, and he actually went with Washington across the Delaware to fight in Trenton and Princeton. And in fact, at the Second Battle of Trenton, when the Cornwallis had come down and was getting ready to attack the Americans at Trenton, Washington held a council of war. It was Thomas Mifflin who suggested, because one of the things they were thinking about was just retreating back to Pennsylvania or fighting this battle against overwhelming odds with the British. And Mifflin's the one who had the third alternative. Well, why don't we sneak away, but instead of retreating, we'll go up this back road and attack Princeton instead. So he is is credited with that suggestion. Although some people say that Washington really told him to bring it up to the council, so who knows. But anyway, given his service during the Trenton campaign, um, he was put on the short list to be promoted to Major General, which he was with that classic February 1777.
And ever since his promotion very early on to Brigadier General, Thomas Mifflin is essentially the highest ranking Pennsylvanian in the Continental Army,
I think so.
which is significant because Pennsylvania is arguably the most, alongside Virginia, arguably the most important state. At least, Virginia had a lot of finances, but Pennsylvania had Philadelphia, which should not be overlooked.
Pennsylvania had a very large population. It was an important central state, one of the biggest, but they never really contributed the soldiers to the Continental Army that a lot of other states did. They were very low in that thing, which tended to make it harder to get promotion in the Army because usually they wanted to give promotions to people who had large numbers from their states. And because there was such a large Quaker population in Pennsylvania, they had difficulty raising troops there.
That's why at this point we've been through what, three people from Connecticut, and finally got to someone from PA. Mifflin serves for several years. Like you said, he was at the Princeton and Trenton, or vice versa, and um, eventually he runs into a little bit of trouble. If I'm not mistaken, he now he ends up in the Continental Congress. Remind me, I'm drawing a little bit of a blank.
Well, before that, he is still the quartermaster during Valley Forge, which was a notorious time when there really just was not any food anywhere. So it was very rough going. And in all fairness to him, he had tried to resign several times and nobody else would take the job, so he was kind of stuck with it. But Congress still liked him and liked his work, and they were getting ready to create this new Board of War, which was going to kind of oversee George Washington, and Horatio Gates was going to be the head of it, and Thomas Mifflin was going to be the kind of co-chairman or second in command on the Board of War. And that's when the whole Conway cabal blew up, and Mifflin appears to have been on Team Gates. I wouldn't say he was really hostile to Washington, but he preferred Horatio Gates. And when that whole thing fell apart, I think actually Mifflin ended up faring more poorly than Gates himself did in the whole thing. He was seen as being disloyal to Washington by a lot of his fellow generals, and he was kind of being ostracized a bit. He was accused of embezzlement. I'm not sure what there was to embezzle from the Continental Army, but he was accused, and he was very upset by this and demanded an inquiry, and nobody would ever give him an inquiry, so he was just dealing with all these rumors going around, and he ended up resigning from the Continental Army as a result in 1779.
It's very interesting because as Quartermaster General of Valley Forge, he was there with Washington. He would have seen the troubles Washington was having better than Washington. That Congress was a big portion of the problem, though the real problem was the roads and goods. I should note too, we mentioned the Biddle family before. I spoke recently about Clement Biddle was Commissary General of Forage. So one of the Biddles was the guy that Mifflin sent to New Jersey to try and lug back some of the food from the forage force.
Yeah, the whole thing never went well, and he was eventually replaced by Nathaniel Green as the new quartermaster, who we talked about before.
So Biddle is seen as part of the Conway cabal. As you said, I'm not real sold on how deep in it he was, but he was associated with it. So where does he go from there?
Well, as I said, it ended his military career, but it did not end his political career. He was still very popular. I believe he served in the Continental Congress in the last few years of the war. He ended up becoming
president.
He became president of the Continental Congress, sometimes called the Confederation Congress at that point. but he was actually the one who accepted George Washington's resignation at the very end of the war, uh, when Washington.
So he got what he wanted. It just took a few extra years and a victory in the war.
Yeah. So
And then we're mostly focusing on the war, but Mifflin, as I mentioned, he ends up becoming president of Pennsylvania, which was essentially governor. And I believe it was about the same time he attends the United States Constitutional Convention.
yes, he did attend the Constitutional Convention. He then became president of the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had kind of a crazy radical constitution that it adopted during the war, and they ended up adopting a new one in 1790 and making it a little more conventional, and also kind of making clear that Pennsylvania is a state within the Union, not an independent country. So they get rid of the president and adopt a governor of Pennsylvania, and Mifflin becomes the first governor of Pennsylvania as well. Um,
So he spends about a decade as the chief executive of Pennsylvania during the early republic.
yeah, a little over a decade. He leaves office in December 1779, and he actually goes on, uh, resumes a role in the state legislature. So he's not even leaving political office entirely, but he doesn't do a whole lot as a state legislature because about a month or two after he steps down from being governor, he passes away.
It's interesting. Of the generals we looked at, maybe I'll pop it back over, but I think other than Washington, he's the highest ranking general to actually attend the Constitutional Convention. I don't think
Yeah,
there's
okay.
another person we've discussed. Probably should have checked on that before I said it, but I'm pretty sure he's the. Uh, I mean, I'll double check. Uh, yeah, yeah. Well, so that's great. Oh, look what I did. I'm a dummy. There you go.
There.
You're back. Whoopsie daisy. I was so excited to figure that out. The last thing I always like to add about Mifflin is anyone who watches the show The Office on the television. It takes place in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and the company they work for in the office is Dunder Mifflin, which I understand is very specifically a reference to uh, one of Pennsylvania's favorite sons.
Yeah, my favorite legacy of Mifflin is, of course, Fort Mifflin, which sits right outside Philadelphia, where I live. It's still a fort that you can visit. It's intact, and it's kind of they do Revolutionary War reenactments and other stuff there. So it's kind of cool. There's obviously a lot of towns, counties, etc., named after General Mifflin because of his service during the war all over the state and the country.
Right. So his career ends on kind of a high note. Now, the next person we're going to discuss, also from Pennsylvania, is Arthur Sinclair. And his
Yes.
career does not end on that much of a high note. Um,
No. So
well,
yeah,
it
Arthur.
doesn't end on that low a note. So, yeah, let's. Where do we start with Mr.
Let's
Sinclair?
start at the beginning.
Okay.
Arthur Sinclair is born in Scotland, um, so he starts over there. He goes to the University of Edinburgh, but does not graduate. He's not from nobility. His parents are not poor, obviously, because they can send him to university. His father, I think, was a merchant of reasonably good wealth, but as I said, not nobility, not really the upper crust elite of even Scotland. Um, so he ends up going to Edinburgh for a few years, but ends up deciding he doesn't really want to spend time in school. He wants to become a doctor, so he goes and apprentices himself to a doctor and learns how to become a physician. Um, when the Seven Years' War begins, he purchases an officer's commission and serves as a surgeon on I believe, on a ship. Um,
Sounds right.
I could be mixing him up with somebody else, but
We think Mercer.
he does serve as a doctor, as a physician during the 7 Years' War, and he actually is with General Wolfe during the capture of
Oh, okay.
Quebec City. So one of those famous events. But after that, after the war, he's still a lieutenant because he doesn't have the money to buy a higher commission. So he's kind of done with the war at that point. He sells his commission and buys some land in western Pennsylvania.
And there he
And I say
sits.
subland, he actually becomes the largest landowner in the western part of the state.
Well, being a doctor can be lucrative, I suppose. There he sits for several years until I believe the revolution breaks out. He doesn't. I don't think there's much of note in his life other than buying land that really happens until the war breaks out.
Yeah, yeah, right. He is a part of the Pennsylvania militia, and as I said, Pennsylvania is mostly a pacifist state, so he kind of is one of the prominent figures in the militia right away. And he actually almost goes to war with Virginia in 1774. Virginia was trying to lay claim to Pittsburgh as being part of Virginia, and Pennsylvania was like, no, it's part of Pennsylvania, sorry. And the two almost went to war, but Virginia kind of got distracted by some Indian attacks and ended up going off to fight Lord Dunmore's war. And by the time that ended, they pretty much ceded Pittsburgh to Pennsylvania, and the whole thing died down. So he didn't have to go fight Washington or something in
Yeah.
1774,
No,
which would have.
I'm glad you brought that up. I forgot about that whole event, but you're right. They could have absolutely gone to war versus George Washington, but uh, I spoke to the Attic historian about Lord Dudmore's War a few weeks ago. So anyone who wants to learn more about that, go check that out. As for like you said, this is 1774. So this is just as the First Continental Congress is meeting. He's
Yeah.
almost fighting with Virginia. That doesn't happen. The war breaks out, and then um, he's one of the frontiers people who ends up joining the Continental Army pretty early on, I believe. Does he?
Yeah, he
Does he
takes
go to
the
the? He goes
position.
to Canada.
Yeah, Pennsylvania does not really uh, get involved in the war directly by sending a lot of troops. They send a couple of companies of riflemen up to Boston, but that's really about the extent of it. But by the beginning of 1776, even while the siege of Boston is still going on, they're clearly gearing up for it. And he takes a colonelcy in the Pennsylvania regiment, and you're right, he goes up to invade Quebec. Second time for him because he's already invaded and captured Quebec once. He's going to go reprise his role, um, and is quickly promoted from colonel to brigadier in the Continental Army because uh, Continental Congress wants some Pennsylvania officers, and yeah, he's one of the few that have really any experience. So yeah, he goes up to Quebec. He doesn't do a whole lot of great excitement there. And as you know, we've talked about Quebec a lot. A lot of people are just dying of smallpox. I suspect as a doctor, he may have been filling two different roles up there. Um, but they quickly retreat back to New York, and he heads back down to Pennsylvania in time to get with Washington to cross the Delaware and go to Trenton.
And he does very well. Um,
Yeah,
I've seen his story a little bit inflated, I think, in Trenton and Princeton, but he's very important in that invasion and the. No, I'm skipping a year. Whoa, I skipped a whole year. The following year, he goes up and joins the Battle of. Wow, I'm skipping way ahead. Before the Battle of Saratoga, he is given a new command.
oh, you know what? I'm looking over my notes, and what I said before was completely wrong. I credited Thomas Mifflin with making the suggestion to attack Princeton. It was actually St. Clair who made the suggestion to attack Princeton.
All right. Well,
So
sorry, Thomas Mifflin.
I messed that one up. Sorry, guys.
No, it's funny because
I'm
I
reading through too many of these biographies right before the show.
I know. We're packing them in. That's gonna happen when we're
I
packing them
messed
in.
up.
That's all right. So he goes to Trenton and Princeton. Apparently came up with the idea. Allegedly, did a great job. And then he is sent to. Oh, and then he's almost immediately promoted to major
Right.
general.
He's promoted on the same day as Mifflin was, and
Okay.
all these other guys we're talking about today. But
Oh,
these two were both from Pennsylvania.
well,
So we went from no major generals from Pennsylvania to two major generals from Pennsylvania on the same day.
okay.
Uh,
And then
so yeah.
And then
and then
he
he's
is sent up to take control of what everyone thought was the most important fort in North America, Ticonderoga.
yes, the Gibraltar of North America. He's going to go up and take this prestigious command and work under General Schuyler to protect us from a British invasion from Quebec. So yeah, he's promoted in February. He goes up there in I think June or July. Another general, Brigadier Anthony Wayne, had been command of the fort for the entire winter and had not done, at least according to Sinclair, a particularly good job of building up its defenses. And well, uh, I don't want to dump on Anthony Wayne too much because he really had a hard time either getting any troops there at all, and they were constantly fighting with each other, and it was kind of a mess, and he had a lot of trouble kind of just maintaining the garrison, let alone building any defenses. But in any event, St. Clair gets up there, and within a matter of weeks, the entire army under General Burgoyne is descending down upon his fort, and he really has to make the decision. He's about to be surrounded by the British and could have his garrison completely captured. So he makes the very difficult decision to retreat without really firing a shot. And he kind of says later, I could have either saved my army or saved my reputation, and I went with the former. And it was right. His reputation really took a hit as a result, especially in Congress. I think a lot of the officers appreciated what he did. It made sense to pull your men back to let the fight another day, and many of those men went on to fight at Saratoga. We wouldn't have had those men had St. Clair not retreated. But Congress was not happy about it. They demanded that he be court-martialed, and it wasn't until well after Saratoga was over and the Philadelphia campaign was over that he did get court-martialed. So he was kind of sitting around, not given much of anything to do for the next year.
He's part of that whole slew of court martials that come up the following year. Schuyler gets one. Everyone gets one.
Right. His superior Schuyler gets one. Sullivan gets one. Lee gets one. Stevens, who we're going to talk about in a few minutes, had already gotten one.
He gets one.
So yeah, everyone's getting court-martialed.
But we should note that Sinclair does fight at Saratoga.
Yes.
He retreats to join the army, to join the fight. So kind of redeems himself, but as you said, not in Continental Congress's eyes. He sits around for a year or so, gets court-martialed, and gets absolved of all responsibility.
Right. They completely acquit him and say he acted reasonably and all that.
Yeah.
But the end result and the lack of trust by members of Congress results in the fact that Washington never again gives him an independent command. He does continue to serve in the Army, though. He doesn't resign his commission. He feels like he can still be of some use. And he essentially acts as I don't want to say an aide de camp to Washington because there's a little more than that, but one of his top aides, one of Washington's top lieutenants, kind of hangs around with him for the rest of the war.
It's not a bad gig.
Yep.
He doesn't have to do all the grunt work that young aides de camp have to do. He gets to just come in when you need real information.
Right, he's kind of an advisor, and he does lead some regiments and stuff in battle, and he does go with Washington down to Yorktown, so he's present for the final major victory of the war.
So war ends. He ends up going to. He ends up getting sent to the Continental Congress himself.
Yes.
And he actually spends a fairly significant amount of time as president of that organization.
Yeah, I think he spends nearly 3 years as president, which is the maximum. I think you could be elected to
it's
up to
more than
one-year terms.
Yeah, I really don't think anyone else, off the top of my head, maybe John Hancock between his two sessions had about the same amount of time, but and during his time there, the most notable thing is they're meeting in New York City, and down in Philadelphia, they do this whole write a constitution thing that he misses. Mifflin's there, but he misses it. But probably the most notable thing that happened while he was president of the Congress was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, where they really establish how they're going to settle the territories in the Northwest.
Yeah, this is a really big fight between well, it was a fight between the colonies, now a fight between the states. As we've talked about before, there were all sorts of contradictory borders, conflicting borders, multiple claims. We just talked a few minutes ago about how Pennsylvania and Virginia were both claiming Pittsburgh. I think New York and Connecticut were also claiming Pittsburgh at one time or another. Uh, and those claims continue to go west through what is today Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of fight, and there could very well be another civil war between the states over claims to these lands if it doesn't get resolved. So the Continental Congress really makes an effort to get the states to give up their claims on these lands so that they can eventually become independent states. But for the time, they're going to become a federal territory, and yeah, Sinclair kind of oversees all that as president of Congress when they're trying to map all this stuff out.
Right, and we should note that about the same time is when the Northwest Indian War is also breaking out in the territory, because many of the Native American nations have formed a confederacy. They've just several of them lost a war and were pushed over there, and now they're actually figuring out how to work together to keep the Americans at bay, so to speak.
Yeah, and they're actually supported by the British in Canada, who still haven't entirely given up on the Northwest
Yeah,
Territory.
who were supposed to have left those forts by now.
Yeah, and they're providing a lot of aid and encouragement to the Indians to fight the Americans and telling them quite truthfully, if you don't, the Americans are going to take all your land and keep pushing you
Right.
out. So,
And
yeah.
at the same time, south of that, but not too far away, on the other side of the Mississippi, you have Spain, who is quietly corresponding with James Wilkinson in Kentucky. um, and 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 you have the French come. Well, now the French weren't there quite yet. I jumped ahead a little bit, but uh, it's a very questionable area exactly what's going on. And as you mentioned, St. Clair is president of the Congress when this is being decided, and then he's the one sent out west to take care of it.
Yes. Right. As I said, the states came to an agreement that they would give up their claims, but the Indians certainly hadn't given up their claims, and this was by no means a that the British had given up on this territory. They thought they were kind of biding their time, and they would eventually come back in and retake all this territory. So it was very much under contention still at this time. We're talking about like the 1790s. So yeah, um, uh, Sinclair comes in. He's governor of the Northwest Territories, which is this huge territory covering what I just said, 5 or 6 states. Eventually, they all became, and he's in charge of running it all, and most importantly, kind of suppressing the Indians in this territory. So, in addition to being a governor, he actually gets a commission as a major general in the United States Army, which is different from being a major general in the Continental Army.
Right, because the Continental Army disbanded and there was no army for a while.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the army actually shrunk down to, I think, less than 100 men at one point. There were less than 100 soldiers and officers, and I think 50 of those were stationed at West Point. So it was like there was virtually no army for a time. But yeah, they're starting to build it up again. They realize they need to have something to, especially on the Western Territory for the Indians. So yeah, Sinclair is a major general in the United States Army as well as the territorial governor of the Northwest Territory at the same time. And he puts together a pretty big army of both U.S. soldiers and militia, and they go out to crush the Indians. Doesn't go particularly well.
No, they had sent out a few, I believe his name was Harmar. They had sent out uh, one smaller army to try and take care of it. It was a disaster and was the greatest defeat the Americans have faced against Native Americans until the following year when Arthur St. Clair decides, I'm going to lead this myself.
Yeah, and he gets his butt kicked. There's a couple of war chiefs like Blue Turtle and stuff, and they just really know what they're doing. And the Americans lose, I believe, between 600 and 700 soldiers. I think the Indians lost about 50. So it was just a complete, crush, and more soldiers would die in this fight against the Indians than in any other conflict in U.S. history. So yeah, it's a real mess, and Sinclair ends up resigning his commission as general. Uh, his old buddy Anthony Wayne has to come in and bail him out. And Wayne comes in and finally defeats the Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers a year or two later. But even though Sinclair resigns his commission in the Army, he retains his position as governor of the Northwest Territories. So he doesn't completely fade away yet.
Right. And just to clarify, when he loses this big battle, it's the name of it is St. Clair's defeat. Which is unfortunately for him what he is most famous for. And like you said, I find it hilarious that his first big moment in history was the loss of Fort Ticonderoga, where Wayne was there talking trash. And what is it? Almost 15 years later, he has an even bigger defeat, and Wayne shows up to save the day. Great.
Yeah, no, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the relationship between the two of them were. I haven't really looked at that too much,
Yeah,
but that would be an interesting thing to look at.
yeah,
But yeah,
for sure.
so
But
it is famously known as Sinclair's defeat. Some people will call it the Battle of the Wabash to be a little more
It's
objective
not.
and fair to Sinclair.
No, those people are wrong. It wasn't a battle. It was a defeat.
All right.
And we should note that his time, he's almost 15 years as governor of the territory. He leaves just before Ohio becomes a state, but he's overseeing this. Not only is it just before Ohio becomes a state, but he's still there when William Henry Harrison shows up and they split it off to make, give Indiana a territory. So he's overseeing the creation, the infancy of several very important states to the future of the nation.
Yeah, he plays a very big role. His end kind of comes because he is a very uh, militant, outspoken Federalist, and he serves under the Washington and Adams administrations. Okay, but then in 1800, Thomas Jefferson gets elected, and we also get a very uh, large majority of Democratic Republicans in Congress, and they end up having a lot of conflicts with uh, Sinclair as governor of the territories. At one point, Sinclair basically says, we're essentially an independent country. We don't even have to listen to Congress. Congress has no more authority over us than, say, the consul of France does. And that was a step too far. Thomas Jefferson said, I don't think you can be governor anymore. You sound like you're getting ready to commit treason and sedition and form your own country.
Right.
So he loses his job at that point.
Meanwhile, Jefferson's really friendly with James Wilkinson, governor of Louisiana.
Right, he's going to trust people like Wilkinson and Aaron Burr instead of
who are committing treason.
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
Tommy, what are you gonna do?
Yeah, Tommy did not pick his friends particularly well. But yeah, Sinclair, at that point, his career is pretty much over. He goes to live with his daughter in Western Pennsylvania.
Well, he's also approaching 70 at that point, so.
Yeah, I mean, he is older.
Yeah.
But he does live the last 15 or so years of his life as a private citizen in poverty and relative obscurity.
Oh, that's right. He's like, he goes broke.
Yeah.
Yeah. What a dummy.
So that's the sad ending of Arthur Sinclair.
Yeah, St. Clair's one of the sadder stories we're telling here.
Well, until we get to the next one, Adam Stevens.
Well, I was just about to say that, which leads us to Adam Stevens. Segues are weird. Adam Stevens. So Adam Stevens was a Virginian from birth.
Well, no, like Sinclair, he was born in Scotland.
Oh, look at that.
Actually attended the University of Edinburgh and studied medicine, so they have a lot of parallels between the two of them. And I'm looking at my notes here. He's the one who served on a hospital ship. Actually, before Lincoln's Ear, which happened before the 7 Years' War. This was in I think 1740 or something. War of Jenkins' Ear is kind of a funny one. I think some Spanish people boarded a British ship and cut off the ear of a British officer. They started a whole war over that.
pretty big insult.
Yeah, and I think it became part of the larger War of Austrian Succession, and it was known as King George's War in America. It was part of kind of a larger war. I
Right. And
couldn't be
and
too flippant and just say it was a fight over a leader.
right. And Stephen was one of the older generals in the army. I believe I have his birthday as 17, circa 1718, which would put him about 15 years older than Washington even.
Well, right, that's why he was able to fight in this war that was, 10 years before the 7 Years' War.
Right. Washington was
So,
still a child.
yeah. Um, but right, he was a doctor. He fought in this war. When that war ended, what effectively became the War of Austrian Succession, he decided to go and become a civilian and practice medicine again, and he moved to Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is kind of on the western frontier of the colony at this point. It's also where a young boy named George Washington was growing up.
And Washington and Stephen's careers overlap a good amount, despite their age difference.
Yeah, well, Washington at the years right before the 7 Years' War is kind of a kid. He's late teens, early 20s. I think when he's 20 years old, when he gets a commission as a colonel in the Virginia Army, and his job is to go up into the Northwest Territory and tell the French to get off our lawn. Uh, the French had been kind of moving slowly down from Quebec into what is today Michigan, Ohio, and western Pennsylvania, getting ready to set up a fort at Fort Duquesne. They actually hadn't set that one up in Washington up the first time, but he goes to, I think, Erie and a couple of forts in that area, and basically delivers a notice from the governor saying, you guys are encroaching on Virginia territory, please leave. And so then the French say, okay, well, then we're going to set up a bigger fort at Fort Duquesne. And the next year, Washington is sent back to get a little tougher. It gets a little too tough, ends up shooting some French emissaries, and starts the whole French and Indian War.
Right. The original shot heard round the world.
Right. Now, when Washington returns from that, after he's captured and paroled by the French, and returns to Virginia, he is still in command of a regiment, and Adam Stephen becomes lieutenant colonel of that same regiment. So he is Washington's second in command in these first years of the French and Indian War. And they go off together with General Braddock, and they both fight at the Battle of the Monongahela, and both of them survive, like most of the other officers. But that's kind of where they cut their military teeth together.
Right. And you would think that might tie them together as friends, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
They seem to get along okay, or at least tolerate each other in these early times. The two men are very different. Washington is very focused on being a gentleman, even when he's out on the frontier. Stevens is one of these guys who just loves frontier life. He loves sitting with the men and drinking and having a good old time and just kind of the rough lifestyle. So the two men just don't really click for that reason. Washington goes off to fight with General Forbes during the next few years of the war, and Stevens stays on the Virginia frontier, primarily fighting with Native Americans. So he becomes a pretty skilled Indian fighter, and kind of adopts this persona as a colonial frontiersman. After the war, things between Washington and Stevens get worse. As I mentioned, they're both from Fredericksburg, so they both decide to run for the same seat in the House of Burgesses from Fredericksburg. Washington wins, but he's not happy with Stevens even having the temerity to run against him. Stevens was sometimes critical of Washington's abilities, kind of thought that he was kind of a weak leader, that sort of thing, which did not go over with Washington very well. So the two men, and they also they were both trying to buy a lot of land in Western Virginia. They were both hot land speculators, so they were competing with each other for business. So yeah, the two men kind of grew apart during the period between the French and Indian War and the Revolution.
But then we get a revolution. And Washington, who is in the House of Burgesses, is sent to the First and then Second Continental Congresses, and Washington takes command of the army.
Right, and
Stephen does
Stephen, by
not.
this time, is a full colonel in the Virginia militia. He very quickly gets a commission as a colonel in the Continental Army, and before the end of 1776 is a brigadier general. And I don't think Washington had much of any say in any of that.
And then on the February 19th, 1777, with these other four gentlemen, he jumps over Benedict Arnold as well, and
Yeah, I mean, even though it's weird because he didn't do a whole lot before that. He even though he was a brigadier general of the Continental Army, he stayed in Virginia, and he was mostly in command of troops in Virginia, which in 1776 nothing was really happening there. But he did come up in time for participation in the crossing of the Delaware and Trenton and Princeton. And you'd think that maybe showing some loyalty to Washington at one of his darkest hours would help, but no, it didn't.
too late.
Well, one of the problems was Stephen, his men had been attacked by British soldiers a few days before the crossing of the Delaware, and he sent a company of soldiers to go over and raid Trenton as a retaliatory raid for the attack that his men had faced. And his men um, launched that raid on Christmas Eve, uh, um, and and carried it out in the early morning hours of Christmas Day. And those men were returning on Christmas Day as Washington was bringing his entire army over for a surprise attack on Trenton. And so Washington sees these men coming back, and he actually loses his temper. It's one of the recorded times that he actually does lose his temper. It's like, you guys have just ruined all my plans for a surprise by, cutting this raid. And he really goes after, blames Stevens for that.
We just
Right, rightly
crossed an
so.
icy river in the freezing rain in the middle of winter,
Yeah.
and here you
So,
are, ruining the
yeah,
good
right.
surprise.
And he thinks he's completely ruined the surprise. Now, in the end, he was actually, I think this actually did more good than harm because um, the commander, the Hessian commander at Trenton, had been warned that an attack was coming. And so this little raid came over, 40 guys, took a few pot shots and ran away. He's like, okay, well, that was what I was warned about. He kind of goes back to his business. So luck was certainly with Washington that whole week.
Right.
But he does blame Stephen for doing this uncoordinated attack and not informing command that of what he's doing and all that. Um, so yeah, Washington is still not happy at all with Stephen, but Continental Congress seems to be happy with him, and they promoted to Major General along with all the others in February.
And then you'd think that would be the low point of Stephen's career, but it's not.
Right, Stevens is still with Washington in the Philadelphia campaign the following year. His biggest role comes at Germantown, where he commands a division. He is a senior major general. Washington has to give him his due, but he takes a lot of flack for his performance that day.
Well, just to set the stage for Germantown, what Washington's doing is having generals. The British are essentially encamped at Germantown, and Washington's having his generals attack from all four sides.
Right, he actually has 5 different columns attacking all simultaneously, which is really a complicated maneuver, but that's what he's doing.
Right, and is it the is there? I understand it's a little bit foggy, which is what leads to. Why don't you take it from here?
Yeah, so you have these 5 divisions attacking. The 2 on the far right and the far left are militia, but the other 3 are the main columns of Continental armies. Stephen is in charge of one of them. He gets into position a little late. There's a lot of confusion. He ends up getting involved in a friendly fire action with one of the other columns, and then he ends up retreating rather precipitously, thinking that he's about to be surrounded, even though he's not. And again, this is part of this problem is because of all the fog and all the other stuff that's going on. And I don't think Stephen's behavior that day is particularly different than most of the other generals. They were kind of all in the same problem, but Stephen seems to become the fall guy for the failure of the battle, and
Who
he's
does
accused
who does
of
he fire on?
drunkenness and some other stuff. I think it's Sullivan's
Is
division.
it Sullivan? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're there in the fog. They see some soldiers and they start shooting at them, and then they think they're gonna lose the battle and run away. And
Well, because they're shooting at Sullivan, who they think is the enemy, and then the actual British are coming up behind them. They actually are the enemy, so they're thinking the enemy's on all sides of them at this point, and they end up running away.
and so he is part of the whole slew of people because this is approximately the same time that Saratoga is being won.
Yes.
So they're letting Philadelphia get taken, while up north things are going well. So he's part of the whole slew of people who get court-martialed, unlike the people who were at Saratoga. Things don't go so swimmingly for Adam Stephen.
Yeah, most of the court martials took place after the British got pushed out of Philadelphia and the Americans were back in New Jersey. But Washington wants Stephen to be court martialed almost right away after Germantown. So he's being court martialed while the battle's still raging, while everyone's at Valley Forge and the Germans the British are in Philadelphia still. Stevens gets court-martialed. He's found guilty of unofficer-like conduct, and he is cashiered from the army, which is one of the very few times this happens to any officer. And it's really surprising, given that his behavior, I said, is not really that different from anybody else. And I really think it's the court-martial was kind of taking the lead from Washington. Washington was kind of like, no, I really just want to be done with this guy.
He's always been like that.
I've heard from other experts that he thinks Washington's motive was that he wanted to create a space for General Lafayette, who was not hold a division yet, and he ended up taking over Stevens' division after Stevens gets cashiered. I think it was more just a general dislike of Stevens than trying to promote Lafayette. But I will say that some other experts who probably have read more on this than I do think that that was part of the motivation.
And he's accused of being drunk.
Yes, part of his. He's not convicted of drunkenness, but he is accused of it during the inquiry. He's only ended up convicted on the very vague charge of unofficer-like behavior.
And then he returns home, but his career's not necessarily over. He does. He gets elected to office at the state level.
Yeah, he holds a few minor state positions. He does not play any role in the Continental Congress or anything like that. He holds some local positions, but he's mostly a private citizen and goes back into his medical practice. And he doesn't live much past the end of the war. He dies in 1792. So just 5 years after the war. Well, no, I guess that's 10 years after the war ends. It's 5 years after the Constitution.
Right. Well, and as we said, he's one of the older gentlemen leading the army as it is.
Yeah, I think he's close to 80 by the time of his death. So he does live a full life, right, especially for that time period.
Well, that brings us to our last major general of the day of this fourth class of February 1777, Benjamin Lincoln.
Yeah, so Benjamin Lincoln is from Massachusetts. He's a native. He comes from a fairly prominent family. His father served on the governor's council in the colonial era. He was a wealthy merchant and farmer. Lincoln kind of gets an early start in elected politics. He becomes constable at age 21. His father is also a colonel in the militia. Lincoln, as a young man, becomes his adjutant at the regimental level. He's around for the French and Indian War, but his unit really never gets sent much far away from Boston, so he doesn't see any action during the American Revolution, during the French and Indian War. But he does rise to the rank of major by the end of it, and this really is more to do with his political skills and his social position.
So almost, I guess I shouldn't say like Hancock, but you know, one of the rich kids who joins the fun once the war starts breaking out.
But
And
he does take a firm position, he is opposed to British taxation. He sets himself squarely on the side of the Patriots, which, was a risky position in the pre-war era in Massachusetts. So he was elected to he was a member of the Massachusetts Assembly and was one of the outspoken people there until it was dissolved by the royal governor, and then he went on to be a big player in forming the provincial congress and the committee of safety and taking a really active role in all that stuff.
now I understand he participates a little bit in some of the early skirmishes around Boston, after Lexington and Concord. But I'm not familiar with. Is he? Oh, is he's at Bunker Hill?
Is he a Bunker
Is he
Hill?
at Bunker Hill? Or am I confusing him with someone else? Or is he?
I don't think he was
I
at
know
Bunker
he's
Hill.
there in Massachusetts and part of the militia as things unravel.
He was part of the siege of Boston overall,
Yeah, I'm
and
having trouble placing him at any
major role.
particular battles before New York, because that's when he really comes to his own. He joins the
He
New
was
York campaign. He's with Washington. During New York, he ends up, what is it? Battle of White Plains. Basically, as they're getting chased around New York City by the British.
Yeah, I mean, he is not part of the Continental Army during this time of the war. He is still an officer. He was made a major general in the Massachusetts militia in 1776. I think that's what all the other top leaders went over to the Continental Army. He was one to take the top positions that got left behind. Uh, he was kind of being seen as somebody who would replace Artemus Ward, who wasn't expected to be around very long. Ward was obviously brought into the Continental Army, but he was kind of left in command of New England, the area around Boston. And a lot of people kind of saw Lincoln as being the successor to that.
Interesting.
Lincoln does actually take some militia down to New York, as you say. He had planned to get down there in time for the Battle of Long Island, but doesn't make it in time for that. And he does provide some support at White Plains during the final stages of the American retreat out of New York. But he doesn't, yeah, he doesn't, I don't see much that really impresses me as far as his um, military abilities before almost out of nowhere he gets promoted to Major General. He
Right.
was the last American to be promoted to Major General without first being a Brigadier General in the Continental Army.
Oh, to make the jump straight to.
Right. He comes into the Continental Army as a Major General.
Oh, well, that's pretty sweet.
Yeah.
um, uh,
Arnold was not happy about it, but yeah, he liked it.
who is Artemis?
Arnold, Benedict Arnold was
Well,
not
oh
happy
yeah.
about
Well,
it.
no. As I said, he's the fifth of five people today who all skipped over Arnold for seemingly
Right,
no
but
reason. Like you said,
the
he.
other four were more junior brigadiers to Arnold.
Right.
Then they bring in this other guy who's not even a member of the army and promote him over Arnold as well.
Who
So
also,
yeah,
as you
Arnold was
said, we're both here kind of struggling to discuss what he did that was impressive.
right. And Arnold has had all these amazing victories up until this time, and they're like,
Yeah.
yeah, we're just going to hire this political schmuck and put him over top of you
Yeah.
for no particular reason.
Arnold, Miss Ward, and William Heath haven't done very much. Well, we're getting another guy from Massachusetts, but can't have another guy from Connecticut.
No, no.
So he comes in. Lincoln does go to Saratoga, and he has a.
Even before that, there's one more embarrassing thing I got to tell you about him. He gets command of uh, the southern flank of the Continental Army over in New Jersey, and Cornwallis comes out to raid and tries to capture him at Bound Brook, New Jersey, and uh, Lincoln is caught completely off guard, and the only reason that most of he and his men survive is that they're able to run faster than the British as they run away from him. And Lincoln actually gets. They find Lincoln's uniform sitting on his bed, the British when they capture it, and they make the claim that he ran off in his underwear. I don't think that's what really happened, but that was kind of what was circulating around British camps for the next few weeks.
No, although that was the best way to catch someone is was in their underwear, as happened several times throughout the war. Oh, that's right. That's great. I don't mean to skip anything on Lincoln. I apologize to General Lincoln for that. But then he,
He's
after
off to
things don't
Saratoga.
go well in New Jersey, they send him up north to join a victorious campaign. I believe he leads a whole brigade, or a military language is never appropriate. Um,
Well, when Horatio Gates, actually before Horatio Gates, when Schuyler's still in command, he sends Lincoln up to recruit a bunch of New Englanders and help bring them down. So they're trying to. The Continental Army, as it stands in New York, is smaller than the British Army that's they're facing at one point. And Schuyler knows that they can recruit thousands of militia and grow this army so that it's bigger than the enemy that they're opposing. So he sends Lincoln out to New England to kind of gather up all these militia units that are all over the place. And this is after the Battle of Hubbardton, so um, there's a bunch of militia up there that's already seen some combat, but he's trying to gather them all in one place. And he goes to General John Stark
okay.
and tries to convince him to bring his 2,000 or so militia soldiers down. Um, and Stark says no, not going. Stark had been made a brigadier general in the Continental Army, and he ended up resigning that because he was getting screwed over in so many ways. And when he actually takes command of the New Hampshire militia that goes to fight at Hubbardton, he specifically tells the legislature, I will go and fight them, but I will not take orders from the Continental Army, and I will have nothing to do with the Continental Army. I'm going to go fight with my New Hampshire militia against the British. Continental Army can go screw themselves. I may be paraphrasing that last bit. But so Lincoln comes up, a representative of the Continental Army, and tries to give Stark orders to go join up with Schuyler, and at that point it might even be Gates, down near Saratoga in New York. And yeah, Stark says, no, not going to happen, sorry. And this is actually where Lincoln does uh, shine, I think, in my mind a little bit. Because although he's not a military tactical strategic commander, he is a politician and he knows how to work with people. And he kind of works with Stark to get him to do some stuff that's helpful to the cause without, getting to just turn around and run away. They actually do some raids on Fort Ticonderoga and some other stuff during this time, and Lincoln is very encouraging of all that, and does eventually get some of the militia to come down and voluntarily join with Horatio Gates near Saratoga for the final defense. And at that point, Lincoln is one of the senior major generals on site, is given command of the American right flank, and he's the division commander at the first and second battles of Saratoga. Arnold is on the left flank, and that's where most of the fighting takes place.
Yeah, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to point out, yeah, you were mentioning John Stark and how he was so disenfranchised by the Continental Army, but really the Continental Congress that he left, and it adds weight to our conversation last week about Benedict Arnold. Several generals of different ranks, or several officers of many ranks, left the army because they were so angry at the Continental Congress, but Arnold didn't. He stuck it out for his country. Not to get too off topic, but it just reminds me of that.
Yep.
But anyway, so
I think actually the British did approach Stark trying to see if they could turn him. So, but he said no, thank you.
Yeah, it was like him, Sullivan, not Ethan, like all of Vermont, basically. Like,
well, that was later, but yeah.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, no, they approached a whole bunch of officers. Commodore Barry was another one they approached at one point.
Yeah, everyone the Continental Congress was shafting at the time. But anyway, so Lincoln leads, as you said, the right flank into Saratoga. Most people who have made it this far into the conversation probably knows how Saratoga comes out. Is there
Yeah, I
anything at
mean,
Saratoga you would like to add about Lincoln?
it is a great victory. Lincoln does not really do a whole lot in the actual battle, but I mean, he acquits himself well. He's unfortunately given the flank that just doesn't see a lot of action. Although Gates seemed to think that it was going to at some point. Gates was just wrong. Um, the day after the Second Battle of Saratoga, this is before the British have surrendered. Um, Lincoln goes out to do some reconnaissance on the front line with just a couple of other officers. And he rides up to a group of cavalrymen to get some information from them. Turns out they're British cavalry, not American cavalry, and they immediately start firing on him. And he wheels his horse around and runs for it, but unfortunately is shot in the leg and suffers a very serious injury, uh, which puts him out of commission for nearly a year.
Oh, that's tough, especially because you think the Redcoats would have given it away who he was approaching.
I don't know why he didn't
Very
realize
strange.
it. I mean, they may have been loyalists or something in
Oh,
less
fair,
than
fair enough.
obvious
Fair enough.
outfits. I'm
They
not
don't get the
sure.
nice outfits.
Yeah, but
Um,
like Arnold, who is also has a very serious leg wound at Saratoga, Lincoln is laid up. They try to amputate his leg several times. He refuses to let them, and he undergoes a very long and painful recovery back in Massachusetts.
but he does recover, and then he is. I don't want to say promoted. He keeps the same rank, but he's given an extraordinarily high command.
He does, but while he's convalescing, that's when Arnold is given the retroactive seniority over Lincoln.
That's right.
And at that point, Lincoln very seriously is considering resigning and just going back to his militia commission. But he doesn't. He does stick with the Continental Army. And as you say, gets another command.
What do you mean promoting him over me? Just because he complained? Well, no, he got another wound.
Yeah.
He's sacrificed his body again, so we're gonna we're gonna send him to Philadelphia, give him shit. um, so, but he doesn't resign. Lincoln does not resign, and he's pretty much as soon as he's ready to resume duty, he's given command of the Southern Department of the Army.
Yeah, at the end of 1778, the Southern Department is kind of a mess. General Robert Howe, the Continental General, is in command down there. Having a horrible time, cannot work with the Southern governors, cannot work with the militia, cannot work with anyone. And to be fair, he only has like a few hundred Continental officers to begin with. They've been kind of toying with the British in East Florida for over a year now, but not really getting anywhere. Um,
The article I wrote on Robert Howe is titled "Robert Howe Fights with the South About How to Fight in the South."
yeah, that sounds about right. They were literally at like each other's throats,
I'm
and they
very
couldn't
proud of that one
coordinate anything.
particular title.
That is a good one. Um, but yeah, so the Southern governors are being a real pain in the neck, and they're basically demanding that Howe be sent away. And so Washington sends General Lincoln down there, and
Because
yeah,
Lincoln's proven, like you said, as a politician more than a general, he's proven to be able to talk people into things they might not want to do in the first place.
right. I think that's right. I think Washington figures we're going to send someone down there who's not, Howe was a North Carolinian, so he was caught up in all the sectional rivalries and fighting that was going on there. Lincoln's from Massachusetts. He's kind of a neutral person that's coming in as an outsider. He has very good political skills, and he's going to be able to build this coalition that can secure the South
Right.
for the
So
continents.
Lincoln is in charge of the South, ready to secure it, as you say, right as the British start a new strategy, their Southern strategy.
Before Lincoln even gets to where he's going, the British land at Savannah and take back the colony of Georgia almost entirely.
Right.
Um, General Howe is actually still defending against the British at that point. Uh, Lincoln kind of reaches South Carolina. He knows that there are several thousand British in Georgia at this point, facing a few hundred Continentals and militia. So first thing Lincoln wants to do is gather up about 2 or 3 thousand militia to bring down with him to Georgia, and that seems to take forever. It's a really slow process. It takes it months before it gets down to Perrysburg, South Carolina, which is right on the Atlanta border, or the Savannah Rivers border with Georgia. Um, and they don't really do anything too decisive. Nothing much happens there. Um, there are a few back and forth battles and skirmishes, but um,
And I always like to note that Georgia was extraordinarily thinly populated. Like Georgia had only been a colony for about 40 years when the revolution breaks out, and I've heard different numbers, but the population wasn't that much bigger than the city of Philadelphia. In all of Georgia, it was like 40,000 residents.
yeah, and a large portion of them were slaves. I think when you get down to like adult white males of fighting age, you're probably talking maybe 10 to 12,000.
Right. So that's why it would be pretty easy for, and it was extraordinarily loyalist, and the Patriots were divided between themselves in Georgia. They, for a little bit, had two different Patriot governments going on. So it was pretty easy. My point is, it was pretty easy for the British to take Georgia, and would have been very difficult to do any recruiting for Lincoln down there. He would have had to bring people with him, and too tall a task for really anyone to complete at that point.
Well, Lincoln does manage to recruit some South Carolina and North Carolina militia to go fight, but it's he's having the same problems that Howe did. He can't convince them to follow his orders, and yeah, there's really a divided thing. At one point, the British send a fairly small group into South Carolina in early 1779, and their goal was really to try to, at that point, um, Lincoln was trying to take back Augusta, Georgia, which is kind of out in the frontier of Georgia at that point. So the British send this group into South Carolina thinking that they will encourage Lincoln to leave Georgia and go chase after these guys. And Lincoln doesn't fall for it, and these guys like march all the way to Charleston, South Carolina, almost unopposed, and they're at the city gates demanding the surrender of South Carolina. And several people, leaders of the state of South Carolina, are pretty much ready to surrender, and they're making an offer to, become neutral in the war and pull out of the patriot cause and all this stuff. And it's really only because of a couple of generals who were there. Well, one, the British said no, we will only accept on unconditional surrender, and two, the American generals were like, yeah, there's no way we're surrendering. So, but yeah, so he almost loses South Carolina very early on. But eventually, Lincoln does manage to get a larger army. He gets about 5,000 men at Charleston, South Carolina by 1780, and he's really ready to take on the British.
And that's when the main British force arrives in Charleston.
This is when the British get serious. Sir Henry Clinton, who's the commander of North America at this point, and who lost his chance to take Charleston really early in the war in 1776, is looking to reprise that attempt. And he brings down a really huge army from New York to Charleston, lands them, and pretty effectively captures the entire army.
Yeah, they call it a siege, but that's just because they were patient.
Yeah, it does. I mean, the Americans are really unable to escape. I mean, a few of the militia escape, but
Yeah, so Lincoln.
General Lincoln is captured, and 5,000 of his soldiers are captured, and this is really the largest single loss by the Continentals during the entire war.
Right. Although I understand that there was very few actual deaths, except there was an explosion in Charleston. There was no resistance. They just surrendered the army, but the Patriots came in, and while they were collecting weapons from the Patriots, they were just kind of casually throwing them aside, and one shot and set off some gunpowder that killed like 200 people.
Oh, wow.
I actually just was reading about this the other day for the first time, where like literally there were like parts of people thrown up on the church steeple, and there was just limbs everywhere. So though the siege didn't claim any lives, the surrender killed. I think it was mostly British soldiers because the muskets were still loaded and they were just literally throwing them aside. And I
Yeah,
can't imagine what kind of explosion it was, but that was the biggest violence of the entire siege that led to the capture of the largest army captured for the Americans throughout the war. So Benny Lynx ends up a prisoner of war.
right. And ever since then, South Carolinians have not liked the name Lincoln. And that's the only reason. Um,
That's the only reason.
um, uh, so yeah,
Obviously.
Lincoln becomes a prisoner of war, but he actually doesn't remain one very long. He gets paroled pretty quickly, and he is exchanged for a British major general.
Does he end up going down to St. Augustine with the majority of the army? Or is he
I think he's paroled almost immediately and
almost
allowed
immediately,
to
right? Yeah, that's what I thought.
return. Um, he's
Sorry,
exchanged for,
soldiers.
yeah. You guys can go down there and catch the tropical disease.
Yeah,
I'm out
have
of
fun
here.
with your malaria. I'm going to Philly.
Um, and the British get back William Phillips, who was the commander of artillery who had been captured at Saratoga. So, uh,
Oh, that's a fun fact.
yeah, one of the guys Lincoln was part of capturing ends up being his exchange buddy. Um, so,
So,
yeah, after that, Lincoln doesn't have another independent command. Obviously, he's serving as a lieutenant for General Washington and kind of sticks with General Washington for the rest of the war.
alongside Sinclair, just kind
He
of
had
hanging around with no army,
few other generals too that just never quite cut it as independent commanders, but we're not going to fire them because that looks bad. Uh,
but still on Washington's good side, and he does that for about a year and a half. Because when is Charleston? That's in 1780. It's like
yeah,
early 1780, so it's like a year and a half. And then he's there with no army at the siege of Yorktown.
right. And he's one of Washington's top lieutenants. And when Yorktown actually surrenders, Cornwallis claims that he's sick, and he sends out his lieutenant to hand over the sword of surrender. And Washington isn't going to accept the sword for the lieutenant, so he sends out his lieutenant, Benjamin Lincoln, and Benjamin Lincoln is the one who accepts the sword of surrender at Yorktown.
It's a pretty sweet redemption story. Having lost the largest amount of soldiers in the war, Benjamin Lincoln is the one who accepts the surrender. I'll repeat it because it's such a monumental moment in history that
Yeah,
it bears repeating. Um, Now Lincoln goes and takes over the not the board of war. He becomes
he becomes the
minister
Secretary
of
of
war. Yeah,
War under the Confederation Congress is finally realizing they kind of need an executive branch, even though they don't have one. They form some various secretariatships of experts, and including a Secretary of War, and Lincoln serves in that role for several years before he turns over the job to Henry Knox.
right. After the disbandment of the army and George Washington resigns, everyone else resigns except basically Henry Knox. He's like, yeah, okay. I'll
Well,
stay in New York for a few years.
Lincoln is the Secretary of War. Knox is the commander of the army, which, as I said, falls down to like 100 guys at one point. And then Henry Knox actually takes over as Secretary of War for a little while under the Articles of Confederation before he reprises that same role under the Constitution.
Um, and then Lincoln, I don't know a lot about him after the war. He lives for a while, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
he goes back to Massachusetts, and he's still a popular politician. Not so popular in Western Massachusetts as he takes up his role as military commander in crushing Shays' Rebellion.
that's right. I do know about him after the war. I forgot. All these
Yeah.
veterans go back to their farms and owe a lot of money, and all they want is some help from the government. And the government is, and I, okay, my bias is showing right now. And the government comes, it says pay your friggin' taxes, or we'll execute you, essentially.
Yeah, so he crushes this rebellion in 1787. Um, He spent a lot of years as the collector of the Port of Boston, which I guess is a pretty lucrative position and does require some management skills.
That's right.
He also served as lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, but he never took any role in the federal government.
Right. That's right. I forgot. He becomes the very tax man Boston was fighting against before the
Right.
revolution. They create the Constitution, and now there's a new tax man, and it's Benjamin Lincoln. Huh.
Yep.
Yay! Which now I assume several of the people. I know New England was largely Federalist at the time, but I believe it was Sam Adams was anti-Federalist for a bit. We're
Yeah.
getting a little off topic, but I'm sure he made some powerful enemies coming through in that nature.
Yeah, I imagine so. But
And then
that
that's
was kind of,
essentially it for Benjamin Lincoln. Like you said, yeah, he does spend time as collector of the Port of Boston, but then essentially retires after that. And
yeah,
we
he
will,
passes away old age, 1810. I think he's in his late 70s. So
yeah, he lives to be a fairly old man. And then that would conclude this chapter of the generals of the American Revolution, unless there's anything you'd like to add about any of these gentlemen.
no, I think we did a pretty good job with him.
Yeah. Did it in less time it took to talk about one Benedict Arnold. We got through five other major generals. So thank you for coming back. Next week, I'm not sure who we'll be talking about next week, but a handful of major generals. And thank everyone for listening. This has been Generally Speaking, and we'll be back, like I said, next week with a handful more major generals of the Continental Army.